Hi, I'm Gareth and we've had a request to make a video about how to write a descant. In other words, a sort of second part above a pre-existing melody that maybe's already got some chords on it. So what I've put on the board here is a melody with its own chord scheme, and we're going to have a think about if we wanted to write a second part above it, either for maybe a second singer or a second instrumentalist. How will we do that? Well, let's start by just getting a little bit familiar with what we've got as our main tune and the chords that go with it. So it sounds like this. Okay, it's not designed to be in any particular musical style, but obviously it doesn't sound at all like some musical styles, but the principles that we're going to explore are just the same. Doesn't matter what the style is. If you're writing something that's using a conventional tonal harmonic language, the things we're going to talk about should work quite well. Okay, now there are two intervals that work particularly well when you want to write a second part that sounds good with a given part. And those two intervals are the third and the sixth. Now let's have a think about this. Why should that be? Well, if we work through the other intervals, if I go round in seconds, life is going to sound very dissonant. So if I take the opening of this melody and I just write a descant that's a second above it, it's going to sound pretty awful. Because it's just clashy, isn't it? So writing in seconds isn't a great idea. Now, sometimes you may want a little clash in the melody. It's a sort of momentary, subtle thing where a second can be quite nice, where you can have a second that maybe kind of resolves into something else. And you think, oh, that's a rather nice touch. So I'm not saying never write a second, but I'm saying as a matter of course, don't write in seconds if you want this to work in a sort of way that sounds conventional harmonically. So the other interval that's also dissonant is the inversion of the second, which is the seventh. So if I did this in sevenths, I'd get this. So that's not over convincing either. There are certain composers who would make a virtue of that. So for example, you'll find little bits by Stravinsky where you get things running in parallel sevenths like that, and it's very effective in that style. But it's not a conventional harmonic style. So remember, seconds and sevenths are dissonant intervals really. So if you're trying to make something really work, as a matter of course, you're not immediately going to seize seconds and sevenths. Well, what about fourths and fifths? Well, you could go in fourths, but they tend to sort of not sound absolutely fantastic. You can see that doesn't sound great. You can go in fifths, and that doesn't sound great either. You know, you might have the odd fifth along the way, that might be fine. If you were trying to write something that sounds a bit like a sort of funfair or something, sometimes those sort of fifths or even the fourths work all right in sort of moderation to generate some particular kind of funfair-like character. But again, as a matter of course, they're not great. And as soon as you write in fifths, then you'll end up with these things called consecutive fifths, because all the parts are moving from one perfect fifth to another perfect fifth. And that gives us consecutive fifths, which generally speaking, we try to avoid. And of course, fourths and fifths are the inversion of each other. So they sort of go along together. So seconds not great, the inversion of them, the seventh's not great, fourth's not brilliant, fifth's not great. What are we left with? We're left with thirds and sixths. Okay, so if I run around in thirds, it tends to sound quite good. Or if I run around in sixths. So what a lot of people do is they latch onto this and they say, great, I'm just going to do one of those. So I'll write a descant above this and I'll just run it in thirds. So they'll play the original tune and put thirds on top of it. doesn't sound bad actually, you know, that's a reasonable thing to do. Or they'll say, well, I'll run in 6 above it. And so on. Sounds pretty good as well, doesn't it? So thirds and 6 are often the staple intervals that you might be thinking about when you're writing an additional part, whether it's above or below the given melody. So there's the first big clue really. Think thirds and 6 rather than the other intervals as a matter of course. Now, if you're going to do that, you don't want the whole thing to run in thirds or the whole thing to run in 6. And also you've got to think about when you add a note in a second part, a descant in this case, you need it to fit with the chord. So we've got to start thinking about these things as well. So let's have a look at it. So say the first note is just a note on its own, that's fine. If I put a chord of C down next, well, here's the C in the melody. So does it work better if I put a third above it or if I put a 6 above it? Well, if I put a third above it, that's E, and E belongs to the chord of C. So that's pretty cool. If I put a 6 above it, it's A, and A doesn't belong to the chord of C. So in that case, you'd be better to have a third than a 6, wouldn't you? Okay, well, if I look to the next one, I've got D in the melody and a chord of G. So there's a chord of G, here's my D in the melody. I could have a third above it. Actually, it sounds all right, doesn't it? Because it turns that G into a G7 chord. Or if I have a 6, the B belongs to the G chord. So a third or a 6 would be possible there, wouldn't they? So do you see what I'm getting at? If I go on with the next 3 notes, I've got a chord of C. If I run the E, F, G with thirds on top, how does that go? Well, it starts off quite well, doesn't it? To have a third above E is G, that fits with the chord of C. Well, this is just a passing note, just an incidental note stepping between 2 other notes. When I get here, I've got a B at the top, which doesn't really belong to the chord of C, so it's sounding a bit less happy, isn't it? What happens if I run these 3 notes in 6? So there's my chord of C, here's my E, I'll put a 6 above it this time, so I'll go C, D, E. Oh, suddenly sounds a lot better, doesn't it? C's part of the chord, D's a passing note, as is the F in the melody, and E belongs to the chord again, as does the G there. So you'd be much better to run that in 6 than you would in third. So one thing you can do, if you want to be sure that you can get something that works, is to go through thinking, what would happen if I put a third or a 6 above this note? Does it fit with the chord? Because if you can get a third or a 6 above, it will be consonant with the melody. If it also fits with the chord, well, that'll be great. And then you'll have to sort of iron it out a bit, because you might end up with some big leaps as you're moving between thirds and 6 that may sometimes work, may sometimes be sort of slightly less successful. So you might have to do a little bit of tweaking. But if you want a descant to work really as well, you don't necessarily want it to move in exactly the same rhythm as the given melody. So I'll give you an example of something that would sort of vaguely work if we run this in thirds and 6, sort of flicking between them, but we were just sort of using the same rhythm. Okay, so it could go something like this. So there, see what I'm doing there? I'm using thirds and 6. Most of the time, I'm just using exactly the same rhythm. There was a bit over here where I didn't, just because there were so many quavers. Whether you'd really want the other part running around in quavers, you might. You could do a bit of that, it would be quite effective, but you might decide when one part's moving quickly, the other part doesn't want to move quite so quickly. So, thinking about thirds and 6 that belong to the chords, and then maybe thinking, well, can I get a little bit of independent rhythm going? Nothing to say you can't occasionally use other intervals as long as they fit. So let's have a go at writing a descant on the sort of fundamental principles that we've written, but trying to get a bit of independence as well. Now, if I just run in thirds or 6 here, well, it'd be all right, but I could maybe start by doing something like this, an octave apart, and then have a little quaver passing note that takes me to a note that's a third above this one. So do you see what I've written now? Now that sounds quite nice, doesn't it? I've got an octave. That F is a passing note that sort of makes that into a little bit of a seventh. And then it runs into something that's a third away, doesn't it? So I'm getting into my thirds. But I didn't just start by going third, third. I've done something different. And another thing that's coming across here, you're hearing rhythmic independence of the descant in relation to the original part. And you're also hearing that it's not just all moving in the same direction. So if you just stick thirds and sixths above it, everything's going up together, all coming down together. And we could do with a little bit of movement in the other direction, sort of a bit of contribution between the descant and the given melody, for example. So we're getting rhythmic independence and a bit of contribution there, which is quite nice. Now, we could then decide that we're going to keep this rhythmic independence going. So how about I do something like switch up to a top C there, and then I'm going to do something a bit nifty here, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So first of all, rhythmic independence. You know, I've got these minims going here, but I've got crotchets going up there. And it also makes the descant sound like it's its own melody. So we're not just trying to duplicate the same melody at a different pitch. We're trying to say, actually, we want all this to fit together, but it could just make a slightly independent melody. So what have I done here? I've started with this third. I've jumped up to a note that's an octave above this. Then really here, I've got a six. So we had a third here, we've got a six here. But I've done something here called a little suspension. In other words, I've gone from E to C. Both those notes belong to the chord of C. And then I've suspended this C into the chord of G to make that slight clashy seventh. You see, we were saying earlier you don't want to write in sevenths, but we might want to use them every now and again. So that seventh gives a slight clash, but it sort of resolves. So you prepare it here because it belongs to the C chord. You sound it again when the chord changes and it sort of clashes a little bit, and then it resolves, normally downwards by step, into a note that belongs to that chord. Now, can you hear already the descant sounds quite independent? And then possibly we want to go back to a C there. Now, I'm thinking that because the descant has been quite busy rhythmically, while this part's been moving a bit slower, now the lower part, the given melody, is moving a bit quicker. Actually, the descant could just stop where it is for a bit, couldn't it? So we could just call it a draw there. We don't have to be exciting all the way. And then I could just repeat my C. All the time you're writing a descant as well, you want to make sure it's got enough melodic character of its own. You see, that's got quite a bit of character, isn't it? And then maybe here we could say, I'll come back to A because A is a third above F, so that's one of my default places to go, isn't it? If in doubt, just think, all right, third or six, which one fits with the chords? And then that would work quite nicely. And then I could have another third here. Now you might think, well, that sounds all right. And they fit with these chords, F and C. You could decide you want to elaborate it. So, for example, here, so we don't have the same rhythm, I use that fundamental thing of thirds that we've talked about, but I'm going to chuck in a little upper auxiliary note. That sort of just spruces it up a bit, doesn't it? Okay, now if I'm going on to a chord of G, well, I could have a third above it, which is F. That sort of slightly changes the chord into a G7, possible. Or I could go up a six, and the B that it would create would belong to the chord of G. So why don't we do that? So we go up to B there. And then just to keep the rhythm independent again, maybe I could make that dotted and have a little passing note going in between. Okay, how's my descant sounding so far? We've got this. See? So it's elaborating on the original tune, isn't it? By being something that fits with it, that's adding a little bit of colour and dissonance, that its own melodic line, and it's got its own kind of rhythmic life. We might want to stop here because this is a cadence, it's the end of a phrase, or we might just think, actually, well, we'll either stop or we'll keep moving. Well, we can decide on that later, can't we? Now, we've got another G start, so we started on an octave here. Maybe we could start on an octave there. And then, well, one thing to think about is, have we got lots of leaps? Have we got lots of steps? We want a bit of a balance. If we have a big leap, always best to come back inside the leap to create a decent melodic line. So keep thinking, am I jumping around all over the landscape here with something that's a bit angular? Or am I being a bit boring, just kind of repeating the same notes all over the place? Well, just keep that in mind. If I go to an F now, that gives me a 6 with the given melodic note. And F obviously belongs to the chord of F, so that's pretty good, isn't it? I don't really want to go up to A because then I'll get what we call consecutive octaves with the lower part. So it's better to have a little bit of this sort of contribution. One part's going up, the other part's coming down. That's quite effective. And then some of the time you might decide that actually this has been quite strongly melodic over this tune. And maybe I just want to step back a little bit on that melodic sense in the top part and let the main tune come through. Maybe, keep a bit of independent rhythm going. Maybe something like that. Yeah. And then I was just saying earlier on, wasn't it, that we could maybe have thirds here. So why not? Some of the time you could use the same rhythm. I'm just saying don't use the same rhythm all of the time. But because that's quite distinctive, that run of quavers there, we could actually do that, couldn't we? Because we've got there a chord as C. And this runs quite effectively, doesn't it? Because alongside that chord of C, C and E here belong to the chord. Double lower auxiliary notes. C and E belong to the chord. Double passing notes. And then G and E belong to the chord. So there, you get a run of thirds that go quite nicely. But you see, just sort of doing a little thing like that just helps, doesn't it? To kind of keep something moving, so it's not just so we've got all the rhythm the same, but just having that one note just gives it a little bit of a lift there, doesn't it? And then, well, we could carry on in thirds because A would fit with the chord of F. Now, I can remember a tutor once saying to me, once you've written 6 thirds or 6/6 in a row, you might want to be thinking about doing something else. Well, what have we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now might be a good time to do something else. Well, we've got 6 thirds. Would it work to go up to a 6 here so I could have maybe a C? And that would fit with that C chord, wouldn't it? And then I could even, to get a bit of independence in the rhythm, have a passing note that takes me from A to C. You see how that works? Because I've got A to C, I can tuck in the note in between. And that works quite nicely, doesn't it? And there's a 6 there. And then I could have another 6 by going down to a D there, so a B there. And then maybe we could finish on an octave as it's the end of the whole tune. So that second phrase. Because this note is just an anticipatory note in the main melody. Okay, so how does that sound? I mean, we've got quite a lot of thirds, we've got quite a lot of 6, we've got other intervals just creeping in every now and again to make it a bit interesting. We've got some parallel movement, we've got some contrimotion, we've got some bits of rhythm that sort of map on to the other part, we've got other bits of rhythm that are independent, we've got a line that makes sense on its own. If I just play the upper line, Sort of sounds like a tune of its own, doesn't it? But it's quite different from the other part. Put them together. Now put that with the chords and think, does that work? Actually, it works quite nicely, doesn't it? That's not the only way to do this. There are lots of other solutions. It's just one possible solution that we've come up with out of the principles that I was trying to lay out earlier. So I hope that's helpful. If you've got anything to say about that, feel free to put a comment down in the box below and we can have a discussion about things. And if you want to try working with the original melody yourself and coming up with your own descant, see if you can come up with something different that works as well as that. I'm sure you can. You might want to do that in a different kind of style. But as I say, whichever style you're working in, the same principles apply. So notes that belong to the chords, intervals that work with the original melody, a bit of rhythmic independence, a bit of melodic independence, but not so far removed that they don't belong to each other, and to write a descant part that has a melodic life of its own, that kind of musically makes sense and isn't just notes darting all over the landscape. So I hope that helps with the notion of adding a second part or a descant to a given melody and chord scheme.